The last thing Nora heard before the ground came up to meet her was the sound of the train whistle, long and indifferent, disappearing into the canyon. She lay still for a moment. Flat on her back in the gravel, between the tracks and the tree line, staring up at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Her carpetbag was somewhere behind her. She could hear it had burst open. The soft thud of her things, scattering across rock. A book. The folded letter from the Denver boarding house that had seemed so important 3 days ago. None of it mattered right now. What mattered was that the train was gone, and the forest on both sides of the cut was very, very quiet. Nora sat up slowly. Her left palm was bleeding. Where it had scraped the rail tie, her hat was missing. She pressed her hand to her ribs and breathed, testing for damage, the way her father had taught her when she was 8 and had fallen from the fence rail at their house in Cincinnati. "Take stock before you panic," he used to say. Panic is expensive. She took stock. Both legs worked. Her head ached but wasn't spinning. The carpetbag could be repacked. The forest was dense and green and smelled of pine resin and cold water running somewhere nearby, and there was no sign, not a post, not a mark, not a chimney's worth of smoke, that any human being lived within 50 miles of where she was sitting. The panic, she decided, could wait a little longer. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. That was the thing she kept returning to, even later, when the whole sequence of events had sorted itself into a story she could tell. She hadn't meant to fall asleep, and she certainly hadn't meant to fall asleep near the door of the car, leaning against the handle, the way she'd been doing since Cheyenne, because the seats were too narrow, and her back ached from 3 days of sitting. She'd been reading the letter for the 4th time, probably, and then the train had lurched on a downgrade curve, and the door had simply opened, and she had simply not been inside anymore. That was all. The conductor would notice, someone would notice. They would stop the train and come back for her. She gave it an hour. Sitting on the carpetbag she'd managed to repack, most of it anyway, watching the canyon walls turn from gold to purple as the light shifted. The creek she'd heard was closer than she thought, maybe 40 feet through the trees, cold and fast and running over smooth gray stones. She found it and washed her hand and drank from it with cupped palms because her canteen was with her trunk in the baggage car, wherever that was now. No one came back. It occurred to her, sitting by that creek as the temperature began to drop, in a way that suggested evening was not a distant prospect, that no one on that train knew her name. She'd boarded in Cincinnati after buying her ticket with cash. She'd eaten alone. She'd spoken to no one except a brief exchange with the porter about the location of the water closet. She could disappear off that train, and the only people in the world who would eventually wonder where she was were the boarding house in Denver, who would simply rent the room to someone else, and her sister Margaret in Philadelphia, who wouldn't expect a letter for another 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She looked at the forest. The forest looked back. All right, she thought, then we do this ourselves. She smelled the cabin before she saw it. Wood smoke first, then something animal, tanned hide, maybe, or the particular dense smell of horses kept in close quarters. She'd been walking along the creek bed for the better part of 2 hours, moving downstream because water went downhill, and downhill eventually went somewhere, and she'd begun to think she'd been wrong about that, when the trees opened up just slightly, and there it was, low and long, built from notched logs that had darkened to gray over what must have been decades, a lean-to stable to one side, a woodpile stacked so high and so precisely it looked almost architectural, a line strung between 2 pines with something hanging from it. She couldn't tell what from this distance, but it moved in a way that suggested weight, not fabric. Pelts, she realized, getting closer. Beaver pelts, staked and stretched. There was a man working at a chopping block near the woodpile. She stopped at the tree line. He hadn't seen her yet. He was splitting wood. Not the way the men she'd known split wood, taking breaks to breathe between swings, but with a steady mechanical rhythm, like something that had been doing this specific task for so long it no longer required thought. He was large. That was the first thing. The second thing was that he was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. Even at this distance, even doing this purely functional thing, there was something about how he occupied space that made her hesitant. A rifle leaned against the woodpile within arm's reach. Nora stepped out of the trees anyway because night was coming, and she had no other options, and she had decided approximately 45 minutes ago that she was not going to die on a mountainside in Colorado because she was too proud to ask a stranger for help. "Excuse me," she said. The axe stopped. He turned around slowly. The way a man turns when he's not startled, because very few things in his world are capable of startling him anymore. He looked at her. His face was heavily bearded, weathered to the texture of old saddle leather, and his eyes were the particular pale grey of creek water in shadow. He was, she estimated, somewhere between 40 and the entire 19th century. He said nothing. "I fell from the train," Nora said. She kept her voice even. She had worked very hard in her 27 years to keep her voice even in situations that did not deserve evenness. "The door came open near the canyon cut, about 3 miles east, I think. I've been walking since early afternoon. I don't need much, just shelter tonight, and perhaps some direction to the nearest town in the morning. I can pay." She paused. "Some." He looked at her for a long moment, then at the tree line behind her, then back at her face. "You alone?" he said. "Yes." Another silence. He set the axe against the block. "Come inside," he said. "There's soup." That was all. His name was Calhoun, and he did not offer this information. She found it on a land deed nailed to the inside wall of the cabin, half obscured by a shelf of canning jars. Calhoun, R.W., grant number 1847. The first initial, she learned much later, stood for Reed. He never told her the middle name. She came to suspect there wasn't one, that the W was a bureaucratic invention by some land office clerk who'd assumed everyone had 3 names. The cabin was 1 room, a stove, a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping loft accessible by a fixed ladder, shelves lined with canned goods and dried herbs, and the organized equipment of a man who had learned through long experience exactly how much of everything he needed to survive the winter. There was a wash basin near the door, with a mirror above it, and she noticed immediately that there was a pot of water, heating on the stove, and the cleanliness of everything. Not comfortable cleanliness. Not the kind her mother would have approved of, but functional cleanliness, the kind that kept things from rotting, was something she hadn't expected. He gave her soup. Elk, she thought, or something similar, with dried onion and what tasted like juniper. He sat across from her and ate his own bowl in silence, and she ate hers, and neither of them spoke until she'd finished. "How long to the nearest town?" she asked. "From here?" He considered. 3 days, 2 if the upper trail's clear. "Is there a telegraph?" "That's 3 days." She absorbed this. "And the train. Is there a station nearby where I could? Next stop west is the Ridgeway Junction. Same 3 days." 3 days. She looked at her scraped hand on the table between them, wrapped now in a strip of clean cloth he'd produced without comment when she'd come in, tied with the efficiency of someone who had bandaged their own injuries many times. She looked at the fire through the iron grate of the stove. She looked at the single sleeping loft above them. "I can sleep on the floor," she said. "You'll take the loft," he said. "I sleep by the stove," she almost argued. She decided not to. The first 3 days were the hardest, not because Calhoun was unkind. He wasn't, exactly, but because he made no adjustment whatsoever to her presence. He rose before light and was outside before she was awake. He worked through the morning without speaking. He came in at midday, ate, went out again. He cooked supper with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything else. And he ate it, and he went to sleep by the stove, and she climbed to the loft and lay awake, listening to the absolute darkness outside, pressing against the log walls. On the fourth morning, she came down the ladder and started the fire herself. He came in 2 hours later to find the coffee already made, and his breakfast keeping warm on the back of the stove. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Looked at the coffee, looked at her, said nothing, sat down and drank it. She took this, perhaps naively, as progress. The week she realized she was in real trouble was the week it snowed. Not the tentative early snow she'd seen in Cincinnati, the polite skiff that whitened the lawns and melted by afternoon. This was something different. A wall of weather that came down from the north overnight and filled the world to the windowsills by morning. Calhoun had known it was coming. She understood that later. She'd noticed him bringing in extra wood the night before, filling the water barrel, checking something on the chimney from outside. She hadn't understood what she was watching. When she woke and couldn't see past the glass, her first thought was purely, cleanly frightened. Her second thought was practical. She climbed down the ladder and went to work. There was more to do than she'd understood that first week. The stove needed to be fed every few hours, or the temperature in the cabin dropped with startling speed. The water barrel had to be monitored. Snow could be melted, but it took time and fuel. There were animals in the lean-to that needed checking, 2 horses and a mule, and something that turned out to be a very old dog named, apparently, Nothing, who had been sleeping behind the stove the whole time, and whom she hadn't noticed until he emerged on the 3rd day of the storm to look at her with enormous amber eyes, and then go back to sleep. "Does the dog have a name?" she asked Calhoun that evening, when the wind had settled enough that conversation felt possible. "Dog," he said. She looked at him to see if he was joking. He was not joking. "I'm going to call him Jasper," she said. Calhoun looked at the dog, then at her, then back at the dog, apparently concluding that Jasper's opinion on this matter had not been solicited and therefore did not affect the outcome. "Suit yourself," he said. It was, she realized later, the closest thing to a concession she'd heard from him. The storm kept them inside for 4 days. This was the part she hadn't known how to explain to anyone afterward. The part that happened in the space between 2 people with no shared language except proximity and necessity. On the first full day she boiled water in the large copper pot she found under the work table, and washed properly, the way she hadn't since Cincinnati, heating more water than strictly necessary, and washing her hair over the basin, and feeling something unknot in her chest that she hadn't known, was knotted. Calhoun was in the stable. On the 2nd day, she found flour and lard and made biscuits. They weren't good biscuits. She knew they weren't good, but they were hot, and Calhoun ate 4 of them without comment, and she thought that probably meant something. On the 3rd day, he showed her, without being asked, how to read the barometric pressure from a gauge nailed to the door frame. Taps down, storm's coming. Taps up, it's breaking, and she stood next to him in the small space near the door, both of them watching the needle, and she was aware of how rarely he stood close to anything he didn't need to be close to, and that this was a choice he was making. On the 4th day the wind stopped. Just stopped, between 1 hour and the next, and the silence it left was enormous. She was sitting by the stove mending one of his shirts. She'd found the sewing kit while reorganizing the supply shelf, and the shirt had a tear in the left shoulder she suspected had been there for a year. When the quiet fell, she looked up. Calhoun was at the table sharpening a knife, and he looked up too, and for a moment they were both still, listening to the absence of sound. "It's over," he said. "Yes," she said. Neither of them moved for a little while. She should have left when the trail cleared. She knew this. Margaret would be beginning to worry. The Denver boarding house had already rented her room to someone else, which meant she'd need to find different arrangements, which meant she needed to get to Denver, which meant she needed to get to Ridgeway, which meant she needed to leave. She went with Calhoun to check the upper trail on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. The trail was passable, mostly. drifts in the shaded sections, but nothing the horses couldn't manage with care. She stood at the edge of the tree line, looking down the switchbacks toward the valley, and she could see, if she looked hard enough, the smudge of smoke that might be Ridgeway in the far distance. She could also see what was behind her. The cabin, small and grey and solid in its clearing, the orderly woodpile, the pelts stretched on their frames, the steam from the stovepipe, rising straight in the cold air because the wind had died. Calhoun stopped beside her. He'd been silent the whole walk-up, which was not unusual, but there was a quality to this particular silence that she'd come to recognize. He was thinking about something specific. "The second horse is sound," he said finally. "You could take her." "I know," she said. "I could ride with you to the valley road. You'd be all right from there." "I know that too." She watched the smoke from Ridgeway, distant and uncertain. "I don't actually have a position waiting," she said. "In Denver," she hadn't told him this before, "I had a letter, but it was from a school that wanted a teacher who could also serve as housekeeper for the headmaster's family, and I had decided by Cheyenne that I wasn't going to do that." He was quiet. "I don't know what I was going to do instead," she said. "That was rather the problem. You're good with the animals," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation, a fact being offered, the way he offered everything, plainly, without flourish, take it or leave it. "I've learned," she said. "You made the whole winter supply list last week without asking. I noticed the gaps in the shelf. The biscuits are better." She looked at him. He was looking at the valley, expressionless. "That is an extraordinarily low bar," she said. Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but was structurally related to one. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "I want to say that first, all right? But there's the loft, and there's more work than one person can do cleanly, and the winter was." He stopped, started again. "Easier," he said. "It was easier." She looked at the valley, at the distant smudge of Ridgeway, at the uncertain promise of Denver, and whatever came after. The series of rooms and positions and practical decisions that constituted the life she'd been moving toward when the train door came open. She thought about the letter from the boarding house, sodden now, in the bottom of her carpet bag. She thought about Margaret, who had married a good man and lived in a good house, and was, by all observable evidence, satisfied with this. She thought about the headmaster's family in Denver, who wanted a teacher, who was also a housekeeper. She thought about the barometric gauge on the doorframe, the copper pot, Jasper's amber eyes, the shirt she'd mended. She thought about how she had not been afraid in 4 weeks. Not once, not even in the storm. "I'll stay through spring," she said, "and we'll see." Calhoun nodded. "Once. I'll start on the rest of the wood this afternoon," he said. "I'll put a second pot of water on for washing," she said. He turned back down the trail. She stood for one more moment at the edge of the tree line, looking at the valley, looking at the smoke from Ridgeway going up into the cold blue sky. Then she turned and followed him, her boots finding his tracks in the snow, walking back through the quiet pines toward the clearing, toward the stove already warming, toward the life she had not planned and was choosing anyway. The second pot of water was already heating by the time he came in from the stable. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. Then he hung his coat on its peg and sat down at the table, and picked up the piece of tack he'd been repairing the night before, and she stood at the stove and listened to the pine logs settling in the firebox, and the wind starting up outside, a small wind this time, nothing like before. Outside, the mountain was the same as it had always been. Inside, it was different in a way that neither of them mentioned, and both of them knew.